The Aedyr Empire, Part 1, Origin. In approximately 2200 AI, a group of tribes called the People of the Aedyr unified into a new civilization called the Aedyr Kingdom. The tribes, small and widespread over the land, knew it would be better for their continued existence to unify. The leaders of each tribe became advisors to the king, chosen by the group. Each advisor would still be lord over his people, but each lord would answer to the Farkoneg. This decision turned out to be exactly what was needed, and the Aedyr Kingdom thrived, spreading out over the land, establishing strong trade routes, and became known to be fair but shrewd businessmen. While the country thrived and internally there was little strife, there were still the occasional skirmishes with the neighboring elven kingdom of Coquelin. Not long after the kingdom was formed, the Aedyr people began studying animancy. Still largely unknown at that time, it was an exciting, terrifying new realm that Aedyr scholars saw great potential in. This potential came to bear fruit in 2260 AI, when a group of animancers, working together, transferred the soul of a recently departed man into another body, creating the first of what would later come to be known as the Undead. The reaction to this discovery was swift and decisive. Both the King of Aedyr and the Church of Woedica condemned this event, and the study or practice of animancy was outlawed. It would never again be practiced openly on Aedyr soil. Conflicts with Coquelin continued, escalating into a minor war in 2398 AI. Afterward, a treaty was signed, and the Kingdom of Aedyr merged with Coquelin to form the Aedyr Empire. With the political and military strife now settled, the Aedyr Empire would become an economic powerhouse. Able to provide resources that were hard to find in other parts of the world, their trade routes became some of the most lucrative in the world. The Aedyr Empire Part 2, Expanding Borders. In 2602 AI, Aedyran explorers returned from over the ocean, telling tales of the ruins and treasures there, and of expansive fields that were perfect for growing vorlis. The explorers warned the Farkoneg that the locals were not friendly to outsiders, but the Farkoneg, seeing this as an opportunity to extend his empire and secure trade on another continent, sent more explorers. Over the next 20 years, the area that would become the Dyrwood was investigated, mapped, and colonized. In 2623, the first permanent Aedyran colonial settlements were established. Vorlis fields were set up north of the forests in the Dyrwood, but between conflicts with the Glanfathans and the War of the Broken Stone, it floundered. It wasn't until 2643 that the opportunity presented itself again. Some Aethesian pilgrims, wanting to escape persecution, established colonies and Vorlis farming operations in the territory of Aedyr. With Grand Valia on the verge of collapse, the Farkoneg wanted to ensure his hold on the purple dye trade would be established. He encouraged this settlement, and even paid to have the pilgrims set up in the New World. Because the Farkoneg was still trying to secure his name in the purple dye trade, he was unable to properly respond to Admeth Hadret when he issued his ultimatum. To avoid a rebellion and leave himself time to oversee the Vorlis farms in Aedyr, the Farkoneg relented and made Admeth a Gref Palatine. In return for this concession, Admeth spent time and resources on the Dyrwood's trade and shipping routes, benefiting the Farkoneg with increased income. For 7 years, the Dyrwood provided Aedyr with a steady income, leaving the Farkoneg time to ensure his trade system in Aedyr was strong. With the Farkoneg's attention elsewhere, Admeth instituted the 10 Years Treaties, ending slavery in the Dyrwood and permanently removing one of the revenue sources provided by the Dyrwoodan explorers, the artifacts from the ruins scattered throughout the Dyrwood. At this point, the Farkoneg's word meant almost nothing to the citizens of the Dyrwood. Admeth Hadret had replaced him as their true leader. In order to undermine Admeth's standing, the Farkoneg found allies willing to explore the ruins against the treaty conditions and plunder them. Soon, Aedyr again had a supply of artifacts to sell. When his agents were eventually caught, the Farkoneg distanced himself from the operation, certain there was no way to link him to the proceedings. But the Gref, using means provided to him by his Glanfathan allies, discovered the evidence needed to prove the Farconig was behind the plunderers. The conflict that arose from this revelation led to Admeth declaring independence for the Dyrwood in 2668 AI. After a bloody 4-year-long war that resulted in the death of Admeth, the Farconig relented. Trying to keep control of the Dyrwood had become too costly. He signed treaties with the new Duke of the Dyrwood and returned his attention to Raid Ceres, redoubling efforts on the Vorlist trade, which is still running today. Aedyr Glanfath Part 1 Early Contact. The history of Aedyr Glanfath before it was discovered by Aedyran explorers is poorly documented, and oral accounts often conflict. Some tell stories of an advanced civilization that left, taking all of its knowledge with it, leaving ruins of their civilization behind. Others say the Glanfathans themselves developed such power and technology that they all but destroyed themselves. That is why they will not allow anyone into the ruins on their land. Either way, reliable information about the area of Aedyr Glanfath doesn't begin until Aedyran explorers discovered it in 2602 AI. The Glanfathans were not used to encounters with outsiders before, and viewed the intrusion on their land as something of a test. The ruins that covered their land were considered sacred, and these strangers, despite warnings, plundered them, taking artifacts. Glanfathans that resisted were captured and forced into slavery, becoming property of the new colonists. Their people, heritage, and land at stake, the Glanfathans struck back, hoping to drive them out of their lands permanently. Despite their best efforts, more Aedyran invaders appeared. By 2623 AI, the Aedyrans had established towns, pushing the Glanfathans out of some areas and enslaving any who refused to leave. They tried to live in peace, keeping an eye on the Aedyrans, and with the exception of a few isolated incidents, it seemed to work. This tentative peace came to a bloody end in 2626 AI. A group of farmers, clearing a potential crop field in the middle of an area dotted with many sacred ruins, knocked down one of the ancient menhirs. Whether this was intentional or accidental is not known, but this incident started what came to be known as the Broken Stone War. It was short, lasting less than a year, but it was bloody and brutal. Several thousand Aedyran colonists died, as well as hundreds of Glanfathans. Though the war ended, the attacks on the Aedyrans didn't stop. An Orlin named Ragd was chosen as Galvin of the Glanfathans. He vowed to make every outsider pay for the injustices done on his people's land. He organized the Glanfathan Fangs and orchestrated a series of attacks over the course of the next 2 years. It seemed Ragd's tactics would eventually work and drive the Aedyrans from Aedyr Glanfath, but then they started fighting back. They became far more organized and their tactics less predictable. Fewer and fewer of Ragd's attacks succeeded. He discovered a new Gref, Edrang Hadrit, had been appointed, someone whose tactics and battle savvy were more evenly matched with his. Eventually, both leaders came to a stalemate, neither able to gain the upper hand on the other. As a result of the stalemate, the hostilities between the two groups dwindled, as there was never a significant result for either side. This led to treaties, developed and signed by both, to eliminate the violence and tension. Ragd stepped down as Galvin and returned to his life. Hadrit set a decree. Looting the ruins of Aedyr Glanfath is an arrestable offense. As a sign of goodwill, Hadrit also tried to outlaw slavery, but this act was struck down by the other earls and the Farconig of Aedyr. Because of this, some incidents of rural violence still cropped up. Hadrit's treaties resulted in 20 years of relative peace for the Glanfathans, still wary and distrustful of the Aedyrans, but willing to accept their presence if they had to. Aedyr Glanfath Part 2 Conflict and Unexpected Alliance. In 2652, everything started to deteriorate. It was uncovered that a number of ruined sites had been looted, and all signs pointed to the Aedyrans breaking the treaty. Glanfathans held off judgment for as long as they could, but when the evidence became overwhelming, they retaliated with all the strength they could muster. Ragd once again took up the mantle of leadership and led his people against the Aedyrans. Instead of facing Edrang Hadrit again, this time Ragd crossed swords with Admeth Hadrit, Edrang's son, Admeth proved to be just as, if not more, capable than his father, and used a tactic no Glanfathan expected. In order to clear out the battlefield and ensure that there would be no place for troops to hide, Admeth set the entire forest on fire near the Ise Uar River and blocked all retreating forces with his army. While some escaped the slaughter, most of the Glanfathan troops died. Regd was captured in a mayhem and transferred to New Heomar for holding. While many more battles occurred, some of which resulted in Admeth using the same tactic, the Glanfathan forces were now disorganized and had lost their resolve. They were easily routed, and by the end of that same year, the War of the Black Trees, as it is now known, was over. In order to again repair relations between the two groups, Admeth introduced new laws restricting the taking of new slaves from near Glanfath. The laws also gave Glanfathans the opportunity to buy their fellows out of bondage. While not entirely happy with the prospect of having to buy their countrymen, who had already been free, the Glanfathans took this gesture as the goodwill it was and ceased their hostilities again. 7 years passed with the Dyrwood under Admeth's rule. The Glanfathans felt, for the first time, that true peace could return to their land. This peace led to what is likely the biggest treaty negotiation between Eir Glanfath and the Dyrwood in its history. Admeth set into place the 10 Years Treaties, so named because it had been 10 years since the War of Black Trees. A timeline was set, and at the end of it all, Glanfathan slaves had to be released. The citizens of Eir Glanfath watched the Dyrwood with a cautious hope. With the extended peace between the two peoples in these new treaties, they truly hoped conflict was a thing of the past. In 2665, Galvin Medra, an elven woman who had taken over for Regd, brought news to Admeth. Some Dyrwooden people were found taking artifacts from one of the tombs. Initial investigation uncovered several more that had already been plundered. As they seemed to be isolated incidents and had been stopped early, Medra did not want a war to start again after so long being at peace. Admeth was grateful for this courtesy and wasted no time tracking down who was responsible. Medra gave Admeth use of her Bishogwin mine hunters, and with their help found evidence pointing directly back to the Verkoneg. Admeth and Medra, now jointly allied against the Aedyr and Verkoneg, used everything at their disposal to prevent the Verkoneg's agents from getting into the ruins. In 2668 AI, when Admeth declared independence from Aedyr to create the free Palatinate of Dyrwood, the Glanfathans stood behind him, offering their support and troops. While the war didn't affect the Glanfathan people directly, there were casualties. In the end, the Dyrwooden people became free, and the bond between the two people was strengthened through their shared suffering. Admeth became the beloved as ruler of the Dyrwood, known and respected by Dyrwoodens and Glanfathans alike. The Saints' War Part 1 Overthrow. There is much debate with historians as to when the Saints' War really began. It is widely accepted that the event that instigated it was the sanctuary flight of Raid Saren's citizens to the Dyrwood. This led to direct strife between the two nations that escalated into battle, the Saints' War. But it is the author's opinion that the war truly started many years before. After the miracle of the Verdun Vorlis, as it came to be known, Weidwin quickly gathered followers, drawn to the stories of Aethys' miraculous prophet. His power grew. Eventually, Weidwin had gained enough support that he confronted the imperial governor. Assisted by a collection of knights and nobles who had been swayed to his cause, he marched on the capital city. The governor was allowed to live, but was forced to abdicate power and leave the colony. This was not from any understanding or easy acquiescence from the governor, but because of what happened when Weidwin entered the governor's palace. As Weidwin approached the governor, according to accounts, his body turned into something that was no longer human. His flesh became luminescent, and his head transformed into pure blinding light. Other accounts suggest that Weidwin had become a being of light at an earlier time, when he was whipped in a public square. The outcome of his visit to the palace, however, is uncontested. The governor, knowing there was no way he could oppose an avatar of Aethys, relinquished his power. The people then asked Widewind to lead the colony. He accepted, earning him the name Divine King of Raidceris. Widewind's rule was virtually uncontested. Initially, this was because everyone was awed that a god had chosen to manifest himself and lead his people. This changed as Widewind began punishing the allies of the old empire and the poison on the world, what he considered corrupt churches or church leaders of Aethys. Scrutiny escalated, and soon worshippers of Aethys were also being punished for mere perceptions of heresy. Members of other religions were also added to the list of the persecuted for following different faiths. This caused large segments of the population to flee Raidceris for the Dyrwood, begging for sanctuary. This caused strife between the two nations. People of the Dyrwood knew that they could not sustain explosive population growth if Widewind's rule were to continue unchecked. They also feared that his eye would turn from Raidceris and land on them next if nothing was done. This was exactly what ultimately happened. An open war broke out as Widewind moved to spread his dominion into the lands of Dyrwood. The Saints' War Part 2: Invasion. Widewind personally led many of the battles during the war, exhibiting extraordinary supernatural powers. He seemed virtually untouchable on the battlefield, able to burn or even disintegrate his enemies with beams of blinding white light. With a god on his side, and possibly, as some said, inhabiting him, he was thought to be indestructible. It appeared that he may have been, till the Battle of Halgot Citadel. The people of the Dyrwood knew that they would lose the war if they could not at least slow Widewind down. Engineers, priests of Mogren, and a few others, working in secret, some say with Mogren's direct help, developed a weapon they hoped would be able to stop a god. 12 feet in diameter, filled with a variety of chemical and magical explosives, the bomb was rolled under Aedyr Bridge. Part of the foundation was excavated in order to allow them to embed the bomb in the bridge itself, ensuring its total concealment. 12 Dyrwooden men and women volunteered to stage an ambush at the bridge to keep Widewind on it until the bomb could be detonated. The battle was short, bloody, and ultimately final. The Dozen, as they came to be known, were able to delay Widewind on the bridge. The bomb detonated, killing Widewind, the 4 Dyrwooden volunteers still alive at that time, and over 50 Raidceran soldiers marching on the front line with Widewind. It was at that moment the Saints' War ended. The remaining Raidceran forces were easy to rout. Even though they had more than enough men and equipment to finish the siege, their leader, previously thought invincible, had just vanished in a rain of metal and stone. Panic set in, and the Dyrwooden troops sent them away with ease. From this point on, the bomb was known by the name Godhammer. It even worked its way into everyday conversation. As sure as Godhammer entered the Saints' War came to be a standard phrase to express unequivocal certainty. Less certain is the fate of Aethys, who has not spoken to his followers since the explosion of the bomb and is presumed by most to be dead. Lest some concerned citizens express their worry or other more industrious think they could reproduce the result, the author would put the thoughts from your head. Since that time, there has never been another documented explosion of such magnitude, and efforts to locate the engineers and clergy responsible for the bomb have been entirely fruitless. Godhammer was a unique, fortuitous occurrence. Its like will never be seen again without divine intervention.